The envelope sat on the picnic table, between the potato salad and the sweating pitcher of lemonade, and nobody at that Father's Day barbecue in Millbrook, Ohio, understood yet that it was the only thing in the yard with any power left in it. Gerald Marsh held it in his hand like it was nothing. A thin manila rectangle, sealed, his name typed across the front in plain black ink, Matter Gerald T. Marsh. He'd already made 3 jokes about it before he even touched the flap. "What is this, my walking papers?" And the cousins had laughed the way cousins do, easy and a little too loud, because that's what you did when Gerald made a joke. You laughed. 41 people stood around that backyard, holding paper plates of ribs and corn, sunburned and full, half listening to the tail end of a toast Gerald had been building toward for 10 minutes. A toast about legacy, about the company his father built with his bare hands 60 years ago, about which of his 2 sons actually had what it took to carry it forward. He'd already said Wesley's name twice. He had not yet said Daniel's, except once, early on, as a joke about the accountant who does something with spreadsheets nobody understands. The crowd had laughed at that too. Daniel Marsh stood near the edge of the deck in a blue Oxford shirt, a beer he wasn't drinking sweating in his hand, and he watched his father's fingers find the edge of the envelope's flap. He did not smile. He did not flinch. There was something almost peaceful in his stillness, the stillness of a man who has rehearsed a moment so many times in his head that when it finally arrives, it no longer feels like the future. It feels like memory. "Go ahead, Dad," Daniel said. His voice was quiet, but it carried, the way a single dropped fork can silence a noisy kitchen. "Open it. It's for you." Gerald tore the flap. What fell into his hand were not walking papers. They were the end of everything he had spent 8 years building on top of a lie, and by the time the first sheet of paper hit the picnic table, a letterhead from the Ohio Attorney General's office, Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, the laughter in that backyard had already started to die, sentence by sentence, the way a radio signal fades when you drive too far from the tower. Nobody at that party would remember the ribs. Nobody would remember the corn, or the lemonade, or the song playing low from the Bluetooth speaker on the porch rail. What they would remember, for years, every single time Father's Day rolled back around, was the sound of Gerald Marsh's voice cracking on a single word. A stranger's name, printed at the bottom of the letter, a woman he had never met but who was, at that very moment, standing 40 feet away near the garage, holding a folder of her own. But to understand how a manila envelope ended a family celebration in under 4 minutes, you have to go back. Not 4 minutes. Not 4 months. Almost 8 years. To the winter Daniel Marsh stopped being angry and started, very quietly, to work. Before we get into this story, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. And tell me, have you ever had to get even with someone? I want to know. Daniel Marsh was 32 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had been the answer to a question nobody in his family bothered to ask out loud. What do you do with the son who isn't like the others? He'd grown up in Millbrook, a town of just under 19,000 people, 40 minutes outside Columbus, in a house his grandfather had built, with the same hands that built half the strip malls and church additions in 3 counties. Frank Marsh, Gerald's father, Daniel's grandfather, had founded Marsh & Sons Construction in 1961 with a single flatbed truck and a bank loan for $4,000, and by the time he died in 2016, the company had grown into a regional outfit worth just north of $11 million, with contracts stretching from Dayton to Akron. Frank Marsh was the kind of man people in Millbrook still talked about at the diner counter a decade after his funeral. Gruff, fair, allergic to shortcuts, the sort of builder who'd tear out a wall himself if the studs weren't 16 inches on center. He had 2 grandsons who couldn't have been more different, and he loved them both, in his blunt, undemonstrative way. Wesley, the older by 3 years, was built like his grandfather, broad-shouldered, loud-laughing, a natural on a job site, the kind of kid who could talk a lumber supplier into a better price before he was old enough to drive. Daniel was the quiet one. He liked numbers. He liked the way a ledger balanced, the small, clean satisfaction of a column that added up correctly the first time. At 11 years old, he'd found an error in his Little League team's snack fund spreadsheet that the coach's wife had been keeping for 2 seasons, $6.40 unaccounted for, traced in an afternoon to a bag of ice nobody had logged. His grandfather had laughed until he wheezed and called him the little auditor for the rest of that summer, and Daniel, at 11, had thought that was the best nickname anyone could ever give him. His father did not agree. Gerald Marsh had taken over daily operations of Marsh & Sons in the early 2000s, while Frank eased into a chairman's role, and Gerald had his own ideas about what a Marsh son was supposed to look like. He wanted a builder. He wanted someone who could stand on a foundation pour in July and bark orders and shake a client's hand hard enough to leave a mark. Wesley was that son, and Gerald made no secret of it. Not cruelly, not at first, just constantly. The low hum of a preference that never needed to be stated because it announced itself in every room the two boys shared. Wesley got the company truck for his 16th birthday. Daniel got a calculator, and a joke about becoming the next little auditor. Ha ha. Wesley got invited to sit in on bids. Daniel got asked, every single time, whether he'd figured out what he wanted to do with his life yet, as though a CPA license, a master's degree in accounting from Ohio State, and eventually, a certified fraud examiner credential from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, didn't count as an answer. By the time Daniel was 28, he'd built a modest but respected forensic accounting practice out of a 2-room office above a dry cleaner's on Vine Street in Millbrook. Marsh Forensic Accounting and Advisory, no relation implied to the family business, though everyone in town knew exactly whose son he was. He audited small manufacturers. He testified as an expert witness in 2 embezzlement trials in Franklin County. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of son most fathers would brag about at the barber shop. Gerald Marsh had never once, in Daniel's adult life, called him anything but the accountant in front of other people. Not my son, the CPA, not even Daniel, just the accountant, delivered with the same flat, faintly amused tone you'd use to describe a nephew who collected stamps. It had become, over the years, the family's running joke, gentle at first, then not so gentle. At Thanksgiving, Gerald would ask Daniel to do the math on splitting the check at restaurants, loud enough for the table to chuckle. At the 4th of July cookout, the year Daniel turned 30, Gerald had given him, as a gag gift, a plastic green eye shade and a rubber stamp that said, "Approved, so you can finally look the part." Wesley had laughed the hardest. Daniel had smiled, because that's what you did, and put the eye shade in the trunk of his car, where it sat until he threw it away 11 months later without ever having taken it out again. His mother, Linda Marsh, loved both her sons fiercely and equally, in the private, unspoken way of women who have learned that correcting their husbands in public costs more than it's worth. She would pull Daniel aside in the kitchen sometimes, dry his father's jokes off him with a dish towel and a look, tell him quietly that Gerald didn't mean anything by it, that he was proud of you, he just doesn't know how to say it. Daniel believed her, for a long time. He believed it the way you believe a story you've been told since childhood, past the point where the evidence started contradicting it. His younger sister, Claire Marsh Doyle, had left Millbrook for Cincinnati at 22 and built a life far enough from the family orbit that she mostly watched the dynamic from a safe distance, texting Daniel afterward from every holiday. "You okay? Dad was rough tonight." Daniel always texted back the same thing. "I'm fine. It's nothing." There were smaller moments too, the kind that never made it into any family story anyone told out loud, but that Daniel carried anyway, the way you carry a splinter you've stopped noticing until you press the wrong spot. The summer he passed the CPA exam on his first attempt, a feat fewer than half of candidates manage nationally, a fact he'd mentioned once, quietly, at dinner. His father had responded by asking Wesley how the framing was coming along on the Elmwood Street job, and the subject had changed before Daniel finished his sentence. The year he was named, at 27, the youngest board member of the Central Ohio Society of CPA's Regional Ethics Committee. He'd told his father over the phone, and Gerald had laughed and said, "An ethics committee, huh? Good. Maybe they can teach you how to loosen up a little," and hung up to take another call. Daniel had learned, gradually, not to bring things like that home anymore. It was easier to let his achievements live quietly in his own head, unspoken, than to watch them get folded into a joke before he'd even finished saying them out loud. His grandfather Frank had been the one exception, in those early years, the one person who seemed to understand there was more than one way to be built like a Marsh. Frank used to sit with an 11-year-old Daniel at the kitchen table on Larkspur Lane and let him help balance the company's petty cash log, a real task with real numbers, treating the boy's careful columns with the same gravity he gave the actual books. "Numbers don't lie to you, Danny," Frank told him once, the summer before he died. "But people will. Learn to read the numbers right, and you'll always know which one you're dealing with." Daniel had not understood, at 17, how completely that sentence would come to define the next 15 years of his life. He understood it now. For years, it genuinely was nothing, an old, tired family script that everyone had roles in, and Daniel had learned to play his without complaint, because the alternative was a fight nobody in that family knew how to have, without 3 people crying and Linda locking herself in the bathroom for an hour. Then, in the spring of 2016, Frank Marsh died of a stroke at 79, sitting in his recliner, with the Millbrook Gazette open on his lap, and everything that had been simmering quietly under the surface of the Marsh family got poured, without anyone quite realizing it, into a single legal document that would take Daniel the better part of a decade to fully understand. Frank's will established the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust, funded at $2.3 million, a mix of company shares, a life insurance payout, and the proceeds from the sale of 2 rental properties Frank had held outside the business. The trust named his 3 grandchildren, Wesley, Daniel, and Claire, as equal beneficiaries, to receive their full shares, in 3 equal disbursements, when the youngest of them, Claire, turned 30. Until that date, the trust would be administered, invested, managed, dispersed for reasonable education, health, and welfare expenses, in the interim, by a trustee. Frank Marsh named his son, Gerald, as that trustee. It made sense, at the time. Gerald was the responsible adult. Gerald ran the family business. Gerald had never, as far as anyone in that family knew, done a single dishonest thing with $1 in his life. Daniel had signed the acknowledgement forms without a second thought, at 29 years old, mildly touched that his grandfather had thought of him at all, given how little his father seemed to. He would not think about that trust again with any real attention for 6 years. That, it would turn out later, was exactly the amount of time his father needed. After what Gerald did to Daniel, on a scale of 1 to 10, how angry are you right now? Drop your number in the comments, because it's about to get a whole lot more satisfying. The wrong did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way water gets into a foundation. Slow, patient, invisible, until the day the whole structure starts to lean. It began, unofficially, in the fall of 2017, a year and a half after Frank's death, when Gerald asked Daniel, casually, over the phone, the way you'd ask a favor from a friend rather than a professional, to take a quick look at some of the trust's paperwork before tax season. "Nothing formal," Gerald had said. "Just want a second set of eyes, and you're the one with the fancy letters after your name." Daniel, flattered despite himself that his father had finally asked him for something related to his actual expertise, had spent a weekend combing through statements from First Meridian Bank, the institution holding the trust's primary account, ending number 4471892. He found small things that year: a management fee that seemed slightly high, a transfer to something called GM Holdings Group LLC for $18,200, labeled Trust Administrative Services, with no invoice attached. When Daniel had asked about it, Gerald had waved him off. That's just reimbursement for the time I put into managing the thing. Don't worry about it. That's boring trustee stuff. And Daniel, still new to being asked for his opinion by his father at all, had let it go. It wasn't his job to audit the trust. He wasn't asked to. He was asked to take a quick look. He would replay that conversation more times than he could count in the years that followed, turning over the exact moment he'd decided to trust his father's tone instead of his own instincts. The transfers to GM Holdings Group LLC did not stop at $18,200. Over the following 7 years, according to records Daniel would eventually assemble with excruciating, sleep-costing precision, Gerald Marsh, as sole trustee of the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust, authorized 14 separate wire transfers from account 4471892 to GM Holdings Group LLC, a shell company registered in Delaware, in March of 2017, 1 month before the first transfer, with Gerald Marsh listed as its sole managing member. The transfers ranged from $9,600 to $94,750 and totaled, by the time Daniel finished his final reconciliation in the spring of 2025, $612,400. $612,400 quietly bled out of a trust meant to be split 3 ways among Frank Marsh's grandchildren. Some of it went toward real, if generously padded, administrative fees. A larger portion went, Daniel would eventually prove, directly into Wesley's failing pool installation business, Marsh Blue Waters LLC, which had burned through 2 rounds of bank financing and would have folded entirely in 2019 without a mysterious $187,000 loan that was never documented as a loan anywhere in Marsh Blue Waters' own books, because it wasn't a loan. It was trust money, laundered through GM Holdings Group and then out again, dressed up as a business investment Gerald made on the family's behalf, and some of it, a smaller sum, but the one that would matter most, legally, in the end, went to cover 4 wire transfers with forged authorization signatures. Trust withdrawals of any size above $10,000 required, under First Meridian's own internal compliance policy for fiduciary accounts, a co-signature from a secondary authorized party, in this case, Linda Marsh, listed as a backup signatory on the account when it was first opened, a formality nobody had ever expected to matter. Linda Marsh had never signed those 4 transfer authorizations. Daniel would eventually prove that too, with the help of someone whose name did not yet mean anything to him in 2017, but would come to mean everything by 2025, a forensic document examiner named Denise Calloway. None of that was visible yet. In the fall of 2017, what was visible, what Daniel could see with his own eyes, at his own family's table, was the slow curdling of a household dynamic that had always leaned on him a little too hard, now tightening like a screw with nowhere left to go. Every Father's Day, Gerald hosted a barbecue in the backyard of the family's house on Larkspur Lane, a tradition going back to Frank's era, one Gerald had inherited along with the company, and, evidently, along with a growing appetite to use the occasion as a stage. In 2018, at the barbecue, Gerald gave a toast to real builders, looking pointedly at Wesley, and joked that Daniel builds spreadsheets, which I guess counts if you squint. In 2020, masked and distanced but not quiet, Gerald announced that Wesley would be taking over as VP of Operations at Marsh & Sons, a title with a 6-figure salary and a company truck, while introducing Daniel to a family friend as "my son who does taxes, you know, the safe one." In 2022, at a Father's Day dinner scaled back to immediate family because of a rainstorm, Gerald had, after 2 beers, told a long story about how Frank used to worry Daniel didn't have what it takes to really run anything, a story Daniel was fairly sure his grandfather had never actually told, given that Frank had called him the little auditor with genuine pride until the day he died. By 2023, the joke had a name. Gerald had started calling him, in front of extended family, the file cabinet, because, as Gerald liked to explain to anyone who'd listen, you put something in front of him and it just sits there, safe, boring, never does anything with it. Cousins picked it up. Aunts picked it up. At the 2023 Father's Day barbecue, someone, Daniel never found out who, though he suspected his Uncle Ray, had brought an actual small metal file cabinet as a gag gift, 2 drawers, spray-painted gold, with a bow taped to the top. Daniel had laughed along with everyone else, because the alternative was making 41 relatives feel the temperature of the yard drop in real time, and he had learned, by then, that the family did not know how to hold discomfort. It only knew how to laugh through it. There were other jokes that year, ones that had started to draw actual blood rather than just sting. At a company Christmas party in December 2023, held at the VFW Hall on Route 9, with most of the Marsh & Sons crew and their families in attendance, Gerald had introduced Daniel to a new foreman by saying, "This is my other son. He keeps the books balanced at home, so the rest of us don't have to think about it." And the foreman, not knowing any better, had laughed politely and moved on, and Daniel had stood there holding a plastic cup of eggnog, 31 years old, feeling exactly as small as he had at 11, except now there was no grandfather 2 feet away to call him the little auditor and undo it. At Easter that same year, Gerald had made Daniel the punchline of a story about a client dispute at Marsh & Sons, a real one, involving a $40,000 change order, joking that we almost called in the accountant, but then we remembered he only knows how to say no to things, never how to build them, to a table of 10 relatives who laughed because Gerald's timing, whatever else you could say about him, was genuinely good. Daniel began, without fully admitting it to himself yet, keeping a private mental ledger of these moments, the same way he kept a ledger of the trust's discrepancies, not out of self-pity, but because the accountant in him could not stop cataloging patterns once he noticed one forming. 8 years of jokes. 8 years of the file cabinet, the little auditor turned insult instead of affection. The safe one. The accountant who does something with spreadsheets nobody understands. And running underneath all of it, invisible until March of 2024, $612,400, quietly leaving an account that was supposed to belong, in equal thirds, to a boy who used to balance petty cash logs at his grandfather's kitchen table, a girl who'd moved 2 hours away to get some peace, and a golden son who never once had to ask where his father's confidence in him came from. He drove home that night, alone. He'd been divorced 2 years by then, a quiet, amicable split from his college girlfriend that his father had somehow also managed to make a joke about. Guess even the numbers didn't add up there, buddy? And he sat in his driveway for 11 minutes without going inside, not crying, just sitting, doing, in his head, the thing he was best at in the world, adding things up. By that point, he had already noticed enough irregularities in the trust's paperwork, a request in 2022 for tax documents he'd made just to be thorough before the trust's 5-year mark, followed by Gerald stalling for 9 months on producing full statements, that a small, cold, professional part of his brain, the part trained by 6 years of forensic accounting casework, had started keeping its own private file. Not out of vengeance, not yet, out of the same instinct that made him double-check a Little League snack fund at 11 years old. Something did not add up. He wanted to know what. The breaking point, the true one, the one that finally moved him from suspicion to action, arrived not at a Father's Day barbecue at all, but on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2024, in the parking lot of a Fifth Third Bank branch in Millbrook. Daniel had gone in to co-sign a small business loan document for a client, unrelated to his family entirely, and had run into Roland Tate, a compliance officer he'd worked with professionally twice before on unrelated fraud cases, someone who knew Daniel by reputation as a careful, credentialed forensic accountant, rather than as the accountant from the Marsh family jokes. Roland, making small talk in the parking lot, mentioned, without thinking much of it, the way people mention things they assume are common knowledge, that he'd recently reviewed a compliance flag on a fiduciary account transfer that had your last name on it, funny coincidence, involving a wire authorization that hadn't matched the signature card on file. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He called Roland the next morning, this time not as a passing acquaintance, but as a professional asking a professional question, and Roland, after confirming Daniel had every legal right, as a co-beneficiary of the trust in question, to request an accounting under Ohio's Uniform Trust Code, agreed to walk him, generally and carefully, staying within the bounds of what he could ethically share, through what a signature mismatch flag on a fiduciary account actually meant. It meant someone had signed Linda Marsh's name on documents Linda Marsh had never seen. Daniel sat in his office above the dry cleaners on Vine Street that night, with the lights off and the blinds drawn, and for the first time in his adult life, he let himself feel the full weight of 8 years of small, cutting jokes, and connected it, cleanly, the way only he could, to a growing, specific, provable number. His father had not just belittled him at every family gathering since 2017. His father had been stealing from him, from Claire, using a trust his own grandfather had built, and doing it while calling Daniel a file cabinet in front of 41 relatives holding paper plates. He did not raise his voice. He did not call his father that night, or the next day, or the week after. He thought, briefly, about calling his mother, about driving straight to Larkspur Lane and laying the whole ugly shape of it on the kitchen table before he'd even confirmed it fully himself. And he recognized that impulse for what it was, the same old reflex, the one that had spent 32 years wanting someone else to referee the family, to look at the evidence and simply agree with him out loud, so he wouldn't have to carry the weight of being right all alone. He let the impulse pass. He had learned, over 6 years of forensic work, that the client who calls opposing counsel in a panic before the file is complete is the client who loses. He was not going to be that client, not even in his own family. What he did instead, sitting at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, opening a blank legal pad and writing a single word at the top of the page, was something his family had never once, in 32 years, seen him do. He started planning. Daniel just crossed a line in his own mind. No going back. Have you ever had that moment where you stopped being the bigger person and started planning? Tell me about it in the comments. The word Daniel wrote at the top of that legal pad was evidence, underlined twice, and everything that followed over the next 14 months grew out of that single word. Brick by brick, the same way his grandfather used to say you build a wall. Not fast, not clever, just correct, one course at a time, checked with a level before you go any higher. The first thing Daniel understood, sitting at that kitchen table, was that anger was the least useful tool available to him. Anger got you a shouting match at a Father's Day barbecue that everyone would remember as Daniel finally snapping. A story his father would tell for years, proof that the file cabinet had a temper after all. Anger got you disinherited faster than Gerald could already have been planning, and gave him every excuse he needed to frame Daniel as unstable, ungrateful, the problem child making trouble at his own grandfather's memory. What Daniel needed instead, what 8 years of watching his father operate had taught him, without either of them realizing the lesson was being given, was proof so complete, so airtight, so devastatingly specific that no amount of charm, no toast, no joke, no room full of relatives laughing along could talk its way out of it. He needed to build a case the way he'd build one for a client. He needed, in short, to audit his own father. He gave himself, in those first few days, exactly one rule, written at the bottom of that same legal pad in smaller handwriting than the word above it. Nothing goes into this file that I cannot prove 3 separate ways. Not because he expected his father to fight it in court, though he half suspected he would, but because he understood, better than almost anyone else in that family, how easily a story could be rewritten once emotion got involved. He had watched his father rewrite stories about him for 8 years, a joke here, a slight reframe there, an entire personality flattened down to the accountant, one dinner table at a time. Daniel was not going to build his case on the same soft ground. Every dollar would have a bank record behind it. Every signature would have an expert behind it. Every delay would have a date stamped on it. If this was ever going to end the family's decade of easy laughter at his expense, it was going to end because the numbers, not his feelings, were the ones doing the talking. The first 6 weeks, from late March through early May of 2024, Daniel did nothing but read. He was, after all, a certified public accountant and a certified fraud examiner, but even professionals refresh themselves before the case that matters most. He pulled Ohio's Uniform Trust Code, specifically the sections governing a beneficiary's right to request a full accounting from a trustee, Ohio Revised Code Chapter 5808, the duties of loyalty and prudent administration a trustee owes beneficiaries, and the remedies available under Chapter 58110 for breach of those duties, including removal of a trustee and surcharge for losses. He read about the Ohio Attorney General's Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, which, despite its name, also handled cases of financial exploitation involving vulnerable or improperly managed trusts, and he read 3 years of that office's public enforcement actions to understand exactly what kind of documentation moved a case from complaint to investigation. He pulled the IRS Whistleblower Program's Form 211 guidelines, understanding that any unreported income Gerald had personally received through GM Holdings Group, money that should have been declared, and almost certainly wasn't, given the shell company's total absence from any tax filing Daniel could find, created a second front entirely separate from the trust issue, one with its own reward structure and its own deadline pressures on the people who'd committed the fraud. He did all of this without telling a single member of his family. Not his mother, not Claire, though he came closest to telling her twice, drafting texts he never sent. Certainly not Wesley, who Daniel suspected, correctly it would turn out, had at least a partial idea that the money propping up Marsh Blue Waters wasn't coming from a bank. The second phase of the plan, running through the summer of 2024, was assembling a formal legal request. Daniel retained an attorney, not a Millbrook lawyer who might run into his father at the Rotary Club, but Priya Nair, a trust and fiduciary litigation attorney with a practice in Columbus who specialized in exactly this kind of case: family trusts gone wrong, beneficiaries systematically frozen out of information they were legally entitled to. Priya's first piece of advice was the one that shaped everything that followed. "You don't confront him," she told Daniel, in their first meeting in her office on East Broad Street, a folder of Ohio Revised Code printouts already tabbed on the table between them. "You request, in writing, formally. Every single time he stalls, delays, or gives you a partial answer, that delay becomes evidence in itself. Trustees who have nothing to hide produce records in 30 days. Trustees who are hiding something produce excuses." On July 8, 2024, Priya sent, on Daniel's behalf, a formal written demand under Ohio Revised Code Section 5808.13, requesting a complete accounting of the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust from its funding date in 2016 through the present. Every transaction, every statement, every disbursement, every fee. Gerald had 60 days to respond in full under the statute. He responded on day 59, with 11 pages covering roughly a third of the trust's activity, missing 3 full years of statements and every single record related to GM Holdings Group LLC. He called Daniel personally after Priya's letter arrived, not angry, almost wounded, the tone of a man who couldn't believe his own son would go legal on him. "This is your family, Daniel. This is beneath you. You want to bring lawyers into a family matter?" Daniel had listened to the voicemail 3 times, sitting in his car outside his office, and had felt something settle inside him that he could only describe, later, as relief. The relief of finally, after 8 years, having proof on tape of exactly the kind of deflection Priya had told him to expect. He did not call his father back. He forwarded the voicemail to Priya, who added a note to the file. Trustee expressed hostility toward legitimate beneficiary accounting request, relevant to pattern of concealment. The third phase, running from September 2024 through January 2025, was where the plan stopped being paperwork and started becoming proof. Daniel brought in Denise Calloway, a forensic document examiner based in Cleveland with over 20 years of experience testifying in signature authentication cases across Ohio and 3 neighboring states. Working from copies of the 4 disputed wire authorizations, obtained through Priya's continuing discovery requests, which Gerald, now facing the prospect of a probate court petition if he didn't comply, had finally, grudgingly produced in full, Denise conducted a full forensic handwriting analysis, comparing the signatures purporting to be Linda Marsh's against 11 verified exemplars of Linda's actual signature, pulled from tax returns, a mortgage refinance from 2019, and a hospital consent form from 2021. Her written report, delivered January 14, 2025, concluded with a finding Daniel read 4 times before he let himself believe it. Significant and consistent indicators of simulation. A formal way of saying someone had traced or freehand copied Linda Marsh's signature, and it had not been her hand that produced it. Around the same time, Roland Tate, who had, without ever fully realizing how central a role he'd play, kept the conversation going in a series of careful, above-board professional exchanges with Priya's office, always staying within the bounds of what compliance regulations allowed him to disclose, agreed to provide a sworn affidavit describing First Meridian Bank's internal flag on the 4 transfers, confirming that the bank's own systems had detected the signature mismatch in real time and that a compliance note existed in the account's file dated more than 2 years before Daniel had ever asked him a single question about it. The bank, it turned out, had known something was wrong long before Daniel did. Nobody had ever told the Marsh family, because nobody outside the family had asked, until Daniel did. Daniel spent October and November of 2024 rebuilding, line by line, the full financial picture of GM Holdings Group LLC. Its Delaware incorporation records, its total absence from any Ohio tax filing, despite operating income flowing through an Ohio-based bank account, its complete lack of any invoiced service that could justify $612,400 in administrative fees from a family trust. He built it the way he built every forensic report for a client. A source-linked ledger, every dollar traceable from the moment it left account 4471-892 to the moment it landed. In GM Holdings Group's account, in Marsh Blue Water's operating account, in Gerald and Linda's joint personal checking, where roughly $94,000 had eventually settled after passing through GM Holdings like water through 2 buckets. The plan nearly unraveled in early November, and Daniel would later count that week among the longest of his life. Gerald, having produced 11 pages of partial records under Priya's July demand letter, had grown uneasy at the continued silence from Daniel's side. No follow-up call, no family blow-up, nothing that matched the pattern of a son who'd simply been offended and would eventually let it go. He called Daniel's office directly on a Tuesday afternoon, and when Daniel didn't pick up, left a voicemail that was, for the first time in the entire process, not performative or wounded, but genuinely searching. "I know you've got that lawyer looking at things. I just want to understand what you think you found, because whatever it is, I promise you there's an explanation." 2 days later, a mutual family friend mentioned to Claire, at a baby shower neither Daniel nor Gerald attended, that Gerald had been asking around about whether Daniel had hired someone to go through the old bank stuff. Priya, informed immediately, made the call that likely saved the entire case from collapsing prematurely. She advised First Meridian's compliance department, through Roland's existing channel, that any account activity alerts tied to 4471-892 should be flagged for immediate review, in case Gerald attempted to move remaining funds out of GM Holdings Group before the probate petition could be filed and the freeze order obtained. The alert was not needed in the end. Gerald, uncertain exactly how much Daniel actually had, chose caution over action, and the money stayed where Daniel's reconciliation had already mapped it. But Daniel spent that entire week sleeping in 2- and 3-hour stretches, running scenarios with Priya by phone at 11 at night, aware for the first time that 14 months of careful, quiet work could still be undone in a single reckless afternoon if his father moved first. It was that week, more than any other in the process, that convinced Daniel to accelerate the timeline. Where he had originally planned to let the probate petition and the Attorney General's referral proceed on their own separate, unhurried tracks through the spring, he now pushed Priya to file the removal petition as early as the court's docket would allow, understanding that every additional week of delay was a week his father might spend finding a way to move money, destroy records, or simply talk his way into convincing Linda and Wesley that Daniel was the one behaving irrationally. The petition, originally targeted for March, was filed on February 11th instead, 11 days ahead of Priya's original draft schedule, and, as it turned out, exactly early enough to have the court's order finalized and ready well before the one date Daniel had already begun, quietly, to think of as the plan's natural conclusion. He met with Claire in December, finally, over coffee in Cincinnati, and told her everything, not out of a need for permission, but because she was a beneficiary too, and she deserved, at minimum, to know before the rest of the world did. Claire had gone white, then quiet, then, surprising Daniel completely, had reached across the table and gripped his hand and said, "Do it. Do all of it. And tell me exactly when, because I am not missing this." She became, from that point forward, the one person inside the family who knew the full shape of what was coming, and she kept that secret with a discipline Daniel hadn't fully expected from the sister, who used to tell their mother everything. In February 2025, Priya filed a formal petition in Millbrook County Probate Court, case number 25 PC 0442, seeking Gerald Marsh's removal as trustee of the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust under Ohio Revised Code Section 5807.06, citing breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and failure to provide a complete accounting, supported by Denise Calloway's forensic report, Roland Tate's affidavit, and Daniel's full reconciliation ledger as exhibits. The petition requested the appointment of an independent corporate successor trustee, Fifth Union Trust Company, a bank trust department with no relationship to any party, to take over administration of the trust immediately upon the court's order. Separately, in March 2025, Daniel, through Priya, and with independent tax counsel reviewing the submission for accuracy, filed IRS Form 211, the whistleblower award claim, documenting the unreported income that had flowed through GM Holdings Group LLC over 8 years, a submission that triggered, as Daniel knew it would from his reading months earlier, a mandatory review by the IRS's whistleblower office. And separately still, in April 2025, Priya sent a formal notification to the Ohio Attorney General's Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, laying out the pattern of self-dealing and forged authorizations, a notification that 6 weeks later generated a case number and an assigned investigator, a soft-spoken but exacting woman named Marisol Ortega, who called Daniel personally in early June to confirm several details in the file and, almost as an afterthought, asked whether he had any planned family gatherings coming up where all relevant parties might be present, since her office sometimes coordinated the timing of formal notice with cases like this to preserve the element of surprise and prevent asset dissipation. Daniel had looked at his calendar. Father's Day was 11 days away. He had thought about this moment for 14 months, the shape of it, the room it would happen in, the faces that would be watching. He had imagined, more than once, calling his father into a private meeting, sitting across a conference table, with Priya beside him, delivering the news quietly, professionally, the way you'd want a matter like this handled. It would have been the responsible thing. It would also, Daniel realized somewhere around month 10 of the process, have let his father control the room one final time, apologize privately, cry if it suited him, spin the story to Linda and Wesley before anyone else heard the unfiltered version, exactly the way he'd spun every story about Daniel for 8 years running. Daniel had decided, quietly, sometime in the spring, that this year's Father's Day toast was not going to belong to Gerald Marsh. For 8 years, his father had used that backyard, that microphone he didn't need but always seemed to be holding metaphorically, that captive audience of family and friends, as a stage to make Daniel smaller in front of everyone who mattered to him. Daniel was not interested in shouting. He was not interested in a scene. He was interested in something far more precise, letting his father stand on that same stage, in front of that same audience, and open, with his own hands, the one envelope that would make every joke he'd ever told about the file cabinet the last thing anyone in that family would ever laugh about. Daniel is building something here. Do you see where this is going? Drop your prediction in the comments before the plan unfolds. The final 10 days moved with a precision Daniel had not allowed himself to feel until this point. The calm of a man watching the last few pieces of a very long project click into place exactly where he'd planned for them to land. Marisol Ortega's office confirmed on June 12th that the formal notice of investigation and the probate court's order removing Gerald as trustee, signed by Judge Everett Halloran of Millbrook County Probate Court on June 10th, effective immediately upon service, would be ready for delivery by June 15th. She offered to have a process server deliver it to Gerald's home during the week, standard procedure. Daniel asked, instead, whether her office had any objection to him personally serving the documents, since he was, as a beneficiary and petitioner, legally entitled to be present at service, and since he had a specific date and location in mind. Ortega, after checking with her supervisor, agreed, with one condition. She would attend in person, in a professional capacity, to formally introduce herself as the assigned state investigator and confirm the document's authenticity on the spot, should anyone question it. She had seen family fraud cases resolve into pure denial too many times when the target had a moment alone to compose a story. She did not intend to give Gerald Marsh that moment. Daniel spent the following week doing what he always did, before delivering a final report to a client. He checked everything twice. He confirmed with Priya that the probate order had been properly entered and stamped. He confirmed with Denise that her signed report, notarized, was included in the packet exactly as filed with the court. He confirmed with Roland, who by now understood, without needing to be told twice, the discretion this moment required, that the bank's compliance department had been formally notified of the court order and would freeze GM Holdings Group's linked accounts and the trust account itself from any further trustee access the moment the order was served, preventing Gerald from moving a single additional dollar once he knew he'd been caught. He confirmed with Claire, over the phone, twice, that she still wanted to be there, and she'd laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in the entire conversation, and said, "Daniel, I would drive through a blizzard for this." He told his mother nothing in advance. This was the single hardest decision of the entire 14 months, and he sat with it longer than any other. Priya had advised, gently, that looping Linda in ahead of time carried real risk, not because Linda would warn Gerald on purpose, but because grief and loyalty do strange things to people under pressure, and a wife confronted with proof her husband forged her signature needed room to have that reaction honestly, in the moment, rather than pre-processed and managed for everyone else's comfort. Daniel had decided his mother deserved the truth delivered clearly and all at once, not filtered through a warning phone call that would only give Gerald time to build a story for her first. It was, he knew, a hard kindness. He believed, by June, that it was still the right one. He did not plan to say a single accusatory word himself. That, too, had been Priya's counsel, refined over months of preparation. Let the documents do the talking. The moment you start narrating what he did, it becomes your word against his, in front of people who've spent 8 years trained to believe his word over yours. Don't argue with him. Hand him the truth and let the room read it. On the morning of Sunday, June 15, 2025, Daniel dressed carefully. Not a suit, nothing that would look staged, just the same blue Oxford shirt he might have worn to any other Marsh family barbecue, and drove to the house on Larkspur Lane with a single manila envelope on the passenger seat, sealed, his father's name typed across the front. Inside it, the certified letter from the Ohio Attorney General's Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, notifying Gerald Marsh he was under formal investigation for breach of fiduciary duty and financial exploitation of trust beneficiaries. Denise Calloway's notarized forensic document examination, concluding the 4 disputed signatures were not genuine. Roland Tate's sworn affidavit describing First Meridian's internal fraud flag, Daniel's own source-linked reconciliation of $612,400 in improper trust transfers, formatted exactly the way he'd format an exhibit for any courtroom. And, on top, folded once, the certified copy of Judge Halloran's order, removing Gerald Marsh as trustee effective immediately, and appointing Fifth Union Trust Company as successor, with instructions attached for the immediate freeze of all trust-linked accounts. Daniel woke that Sunday morning before 6, made coffee he barely drank, and sat for a long while at his own kitchen table, the same table where the plan had begun 14 months earlier, on a legal pad that now lived, filled front to back, in a locked drawer in his office. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, mostly, the particular calm of a man about to submit a report he has already checked 3 times over, aware that the numbers are correct, and that whatever happens next belongs to the facts now, not to him. Claire arrived 20 minutes before the barbecue officially started, parked 2 streets over as she and Daniel had agreed, and walked in separately so as not to draw attention to the 2 of them arriving together. Marisol Ortega arrived even later, at 1:40 in the afternoon, introduced by a mutual understanding beforehand as a friend of Daniel's from a professional association, standing near the garage with a slim leather folder of her own, watching the yard with the unhurried attention of someone who had done this exact kind of quiet, devastating work more times than she could probably count. 41 relatives filled that backyard by 2 o'clock. Ribs on the grill, corn boiling in a pot on the side burner. Gerald Marsh, 63 years old, tanned and comfortable in a golf shirt, moved through the crowd the way he always did on Father's Day. A hand on every shoulder, a joke for every group, the undisputed center of his own celebration. At 2:15, he tapped a fork against a glass of lemonade and called the yard to attention for what everyone assumed would be the usual toast. He did not disappoint anyone's expectations, at least not the low ones Daniel had spent 8 years absorbing. Gerald talked about his father, Frank, and the company Frank had built, genuinely moving for the first 90 seconds. He talked about the future of Marsh & Sons, and here his eyes found Wesley in the crowd and stayed there. "I want to make an announcement today," Gerald said, grinning, working the crowd like he always did. "Effective this year, Wesley is taking over as full president of Marsh & Sons. He's earned it. He's a builder, through and through, just like his grandfather." Applause. Wesley, beaming, lifted his beer. "And," Gerald continued, "and here, for the first time in 8 years, Daniel felt something in his chest that wasn't dread, but a kind of clean, cold readiness. Since we're talking about the future, I've also made a decision about the family trust. Some of you know your grandfather left some money behind for the grandkids. I've been managing that as trustee, and given some recent conversations, a pointed glance at Daniel, and a small, ugly smile Daniel had seen 1,000 times before, I think it's time some folks understood that trust and title come with responsibility, not just a fancy degree. I've decided Wesley's share should reflect what he's built for this family. I think everyone here understands why." It was, Daniel understood immediately, his father's opening move to publicly announce cutting him out, dressed up as a toast, timed for maximum humiliation, delivered in front of 41 witnesses so that Daniel would have no room to object without looking petty, ungrateful, exactly like the file cabinet throwing a tantrum. A few relatives laughed, uncertain. Wesley's smile flickered, uneasy, as though even he hadn't expected his father to say the quiet part out loud in front of everyone. Daniel stepped forward from the edge of the deck. "Before you finish, Dad," he said. And the yard, sensing something in his voice nobody had ever heard from him before, went quiet, almost instantly. "I actually brought something for you too." He held out the envelope. Gerald took it with the same easy, performative confidence he'd held the microphone metaphor with all afternoon, still riding the high of his own announcement, already half turned back toward the crowd to soak up more of it. "What is this? My walking papers," he said, and a few relatives laughed, and he tore the flap open with his thumb, still smiling. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took him to read the letterhead. Ohio Attorney General's Office. Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. His own name, typed formally beneath a case number, under a paragraph informing him he was the subject of a pending investigation into breach of fiduciary duty in the administration of the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust. His hand, Daniel would remember later, actually shook. A small, involuntary tremor as he flipped to the next page, and the next, the color leaving his face in a slow, visible wave that 41 relatives standing in a summer backyard had never once seen on Gerald Marsh, a man who did not, as a rule, look rattled by anything. He found Denise Calloway's forensic report, signature mismatch, 4 transfers, significant and consistent indicators of simulation. He found Roland Tate's affidavit, First Meridian Bank's own internal compliance flag, dated years before Daniel had ever asked a single question. He found the reconciliation ledger, Daniel's careful, source-linked accounting of $612,400, moved out of his father's trust account into GM Holdings Group LLC, and from there, in specific, dated unmistakable transfers, into the very business, Marsh Blue Waters LLC, that Wesley had just been publicly rewarded with a promotion partly funded by money that was never Gerald's to move. And on top, unfolded last, the probate court's order. Effective immediately, trustee removed, successor trustee appointed, all linked accounts frozen as of 9 o'clock that morning. "Linda," Gerald said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable, his own wife's name, a stranger's signature forged onto documents she had never seen, printed in black and white in front of every relative she'd hosted Thanksgiving for over 30 years. "Linda, this isn't... I never..." Linda Marsh had not moved from where she stood near the picnic table. She reached out, wordlessly, and took the pages from her husband's shaking hand and read the forensic examiner's conclusion herself, twice, her own name sitting on a signature line she had never signed, and the sound that came out of her was not a scream and not a sob but something smaller and more devastating than either. A single, cracked "oh," the sound of 31 years of marriage recalibrating itself in real time in front of 41 people holding paper plates. "I should introduce myself," said a woman's voice from near the garage, calm, professional, unhurried, the tone Daniel had come to recognize, over the past few weeks, as belonging to Marisol Ortega, who now stepped forward into the yard, with her leather folder held loosely at her side. "My name is Marisol Ortega. I'm an investigator with the Ohio Attorney General's Office, Fiduciary Fraud and Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. I'm here to confirm, for anyone who has questions, that the documents Mr. Marsh is holding are authentic, that this investigation is active, and that the probate court order regarding the trust took effect this morning." Wesley, still holding his beer, his own promotion day smile frozen halfway between confusion and dawning horror, had gone very quiet, his eyes moving from his father's shaking hands to the exhibit line naming Marsh Blue Waters LLC, to Daniel, standing perfectly still at the edge of the deck, not gloating, not smiling, just watching. The same stillness with which he had watched the envelope get opened 4 minutes earlier. Around them, the rest of the yard had gone through its own quiet collapse. Uncle Ray, who had brought the gold spray-painted file cabinet as a gag gift 2 years earlier, stood frozen with a corncob halfway to his mouth, the joke suddenly sitting very differently in his memory than it had in 2023. 2 cousins near the cooler had stopped mid-conversation, phones lowered, the kind of silence that spreads through a crowd not because anyone announces it, but because everyone senses, at the same moment, that something has shifted permanently. A neighbor from 2 doors down, invited every year more out of habit than closeness, quietly set down her paper plate on the porch rail and began, without a word to anyone, walking toward her own house, sensing this was no longer a gathering she had any business witnessing. Somewhere on the Bluetooth speaker, a song nobody would ever be able to name again played on, tinny and cheerful and completely out of step with the yard around it, until someone, Claire, in the end, walked over and turned it off without asking anyone's permission. "Dad," Wesley said, his voice smaller than Daniel had heard it in 20 years. "The loan for the pool business, you told me that was a real loan from a private investor." Gerald didn't answer. He couldn't. He stood in his own backyard, in front of the same 41 relatives who had laughed at every joke he'd ever made about the file cabinet, the little auditor, the accountant who does something with spreadsheets nobody understands, and for the first time in 8 years, the silence in that yard did not belong to Daniel. It belonged entirely to him. Now that you've seen how it played out, was Daniel justified? Did he go too far? Or not far enough? Give me your verdict in the comments. The consequences did not arrive all at once, the way courtroom dramas make them look. They arrived the way Daniel's evidence always had, methodically, on schedule, each piece landing exactly when the system it belonged to was ready to process it. Judge Halloran's order took full effect that same day, freezing every account tied to the Frank T. Marsh Family Trust and to GM Holdings Group LLC before Gerald had so much as left his own backyard. Fifth Union Trust Company assumed administration within the week, and within 30 days had completed its own independent audit confirming Daniel's reconciliation to the dollar. $612,400 in improper transfers, restitution ordered against Gerald personally, secured against his remaining equity in Marsh & Sons Construction under the probate court's surcharge order. The IRS Whistleblower Office opened its formal review of Daniel's Form 211 submission within 6 weeks, and while a final resolution would take, by law, considerably longer to conclude, the preliminary examination confirmed enough unreported income flowing through GM Holdings Group that Gerald retained a criminal defense attorney by August, a fact that made its way through Millbrook faster than any Father's Day joke ever had. The Ohio Attorney General's office formally charged forward with its investigation, and in October, Gerald Marsh accepted a civil settlement rather than risk a criminal referral. Full restitution of the $612,400, a permanent bar from ever serving as trustee or fiduciary for any Ohio estate or trust again, and a public consent order, filed in Millbrook County Probate Court, that any Millbrook Gazette reporter, with an afternoon to spare, could pull and read in full. Marsh & Sons Construction's bonding company, the underwriter that ensured the company's ability to bid on public contracts, a relationship worth hundreds of thousands in annual work, flagged the consent order during its routine annual review in November, and suspended the company's surety bond, pending a full compliance review, a suspension that cost Marsh & Sons 2 municipal contracts, including a resurfacing job on Route 9 the company had held for 11 straight years, before the bond was reinstated 5 months later under entirely new financial oversight, with Wesley, cleared of any knowing wrongdoing after his own cooperation with investigators, but chastened in a way that changed him, installed as president under conditions that included quarterly third-party audits for the next 5 years, a new outside comptroller position Wesley himself insisted on creating, and, at Wesley's specific request, a standing invitation for Daniel to review the company's books personally every spring, an offer Daniel accepted the following March without a trace of the old joke anywhere in the room. Wesley did not speak to his father for 4 months after that Father's Day. When he finally did, it was in Priya Nair's conference room, flanked by his own newly retained attorney, working out the terms under which Marsh Blue Waters LLC, now revealed to have been propped up entirely by laundered trust funds, would be wound down and its remaining assets liquidated to help satisfy the restitution order. He called Daniel exactly once that fall, a short, halting conversation neither of them ever fully recounted to the rest of the family, in which Wesley said, more or less, that he hadn't known, Not really, not the way Daniel had proven it, and that he was sorry, sorry for every joke, sorry for every year he'd let his father build him up while quietly tearing Daniel down, sorry for a promotion he now understood he'd never fully earned on his own merit. Daniel accepted the apology the way he accepted most things, quietly, without theater, and without fully deciding, that day, whether it changed anything between them. Linda Marsh filed for legal separation from Gerald in September, not out of anger at the fraud itself, she told Claire over the phone, but because she could not stop seeing her own forged signature every time she looked at him. 4 documents, a name that wasn't in her hand, and a silence from her husband of 31 years that had let it happen. She moved into a condo near Claire in Cincinnati by the following spring, closer to her daughter, and, increasingly, closer to Daniel, who drove down more Sundays than he ever had before. The trust itself, under Fifth Union's independent administration, resumed proper disbursement on schedule. Claire, having turned 30 the previous winter, received her full 1/3 share the following spring, $766,667, restored in full, restitution and all. Daniel received his. Wesley, remarkably, received his too, the trust's terms honoring all 3 grandchildren equally, exactly as Frank Marsh had always intended. A detail Daniel made sure of personally, instructing Priya early in the process that whatever his father had done, Frank's original wishes for all 3 grandchildren deserved to be honored in full. It was, he told Claire once, the one piece of the plan that had nothing to do with revenge at all. It was simply correct. Daniel Marsh still runs his forensic accounting practice above the dry cleaners on Vine Street, though he's added 2 junior associates in the past year and moved the sign out front from Marsh Forensic Accounting and Advisory to something slightly larger, slightly more confident, the same understated size and font it's always been, just a little more room for the letters. He gave a deposition in the civil matter, testified once before a probate magistrate, and has otherwise stayed almost entirely out of the public record, his own careful work created. No interviews, no statements to the Gazette, nothing that would turn 14 months of quiet, disciplined evidence gathering into a spectacle he never wanted it to be. He still goes to family gatherings, though the shape of them has changed. Thanksgiving this past year was at Claire's house in Cincinnati, smaller, quieter, no toasts about who was a real builder and who wasn't. His mother sat next to him the whole afternoon, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand for no particular reason, the way people do when they're still recalibrating what gratitude feels like after 31 years of not quite seeing what was happening in their own house. Wesley came too, this time, and the conversation between the 2 brothers was careful, still rebuilding, but real in a way it had never fully been before. 2 men figuring out, slowly, what it looks like to be brothers without a father orchestrating the distance between them from a stage he no longer holds. Gerald Marsh was not there. He lives alone now, in a smaller house on the other side of Millbrook, permanently barred from ever serving as a trustee again, his name attached, in the public record of Millbrook County, to a consent order anyone can read. Daniel has spoken to him twice since that Father's Day. Brief, business-like calls related to the restitution schedule, nothing more. He has not decided whether there will ever be more than that, and he has stopped feeling any pressure to decide quickly. That, too, he considers part of what 14 months of careful work bought him, the right to take his time, on his own terms for once, in a family that spent 8 years insisting he never had any terms of his own to set. Was it worth it? Daniel gets asked that, sometimes, by the few people who know the full story. Priya, Claire, Roland, once, over coffee, half joking, half not. He answers it the same way every time, in the same even, unhurried voice that used to get called boring at family barbecues, and now, in courtrooms and depositions, gets called precise. He didn't do it for the money, though the money is real, and restored, and sitting exactly where his grandfather always meant for it to sit. He didn't do it to destroy his father, though the consequences that landed were entirely his father's own making, built dollar by forged dollar over 8 patient years. He did it because somewhere around his 11th birthday, a man who loved him uncomplicatedly had looked at a $6 discrepancy in a Little League snack fund and called him the Little Auditor with genuine, unguarded pride, and Daniel had spent the next 21 years slowly forgetting that a quiet person who notices what doesn't add up is not a joke. He is, if you give him 14 months and a legal pad, the only person in the room capable of making everything finally balance. He keeps one thing from that Father's Day, tucked in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in his office above the dry cleaners. Not a trophy, nothing framed or displayed, just the original certified copy of Judge Halloran's order, the one that started freezing accounts before his father had even set down the envelope it came in. He doesn't take it out often, but every so often, on a slow afternoon, closing out a client file or reconciling a set of books that finally, satisfyingly balance to the penny, he'll open that drawer for a moment, just to remind himself of the plain, quiet fact his grandfather tried to teach him at a kitchen table 30 years ago. That the truth, given enough time and enough patience, always adds up in the end. And that the people who laugh loudest at the ones who count carefully are usually the ones with the most to lose when somebody finally checks the math. If you've ever gotten even, or wished you had, tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story hit home, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next vault.